Friday, November 16, 1990. A single bucket. An open gate. And one man who would never walk out of a bear enclosure again. This is how wildlife experts learned that feeding a wild animal every single morning for nearly a decade does not make it safe, it makes it dangerous in ways no one saw coming. In the early 1980s, Bob Doornbos ran a small private wildlife facility in rural Osceola County, Michigan. He cared for exotic and native animals, wolves, big cats, and bears. Most were rescues or came from other facilities. Then one winter, a Kodiak bear cub arrived, small enough to hold in both arms. Bob bottle-fed that cub through its first winter. He named the bear Thor. He cleaned Thor's enclosure, treated Thor's injuries, and talked to him every single day. By the time Thor was 2 years old, Bob Doornbos was the only human the bear fully trusted. Thor grew into one of the largest animals on the property, nearly 900 pounds of pure muscle and raw power. Visitors who came to the facility would stop and stare at the enormous bear. But Bob Doornbos never stared. To Bob, Thor was still the cub he had saved. Every single morning for nearly 8 years, Bob Doornbos followed the same routine. He would fill the bucket with raw meat and scraps, walk the path to Thor's gate, and step inside the enclosure to feed him face to face. He had done it thousands of times. He saw no reason to stop. To Bob Doornbos, this was not dangerous. This was trust. This was a bond forged in Thor's first helpless weeks of life. Other wildlife experts had warned him. They said a wild animal, no matter how hand-raised, would always be a wild animal. Bob Doornbos believed he was different. He believed his care and his presence had changed Thor's nature. On the morning of November 16, 1990, Bob Doornbos woke before dawn. The temperature was below freezing. He prepared Thor's food as he always did and walked to the enclosure. There was nothing in his routine that was different. Nothing that suggested this morning would be the last. What witnesses and wildlife investigators would later piece together from evidence at the scene is that Thor's behavior changed in an instant. There was no warning. No snarl. No display of aggression. The bear simply attacked. Thor was 900 pounds of raw power, and Bob Doornbos was alone inside the enclosure with him. When Bob Doornbos did not return to the farmhouse that morning, his family went looking. They found the gate open. They found the bucket. They found Thor still in the enclosure. But Bob Doornbos was gone. He was pronounced dead at the scene for massive trauma and blood loss. Wildlife investigators and state officials arrived within hours. They documented everything. The gate. The bucket. The evidence that Thor had killed Bob Doornbos in seconds. The question that haunted every investigator was the same: why? Thor had never shown aggression before. No one knew if something had triggered the bear that morning: a sound, a smell, a shift in weather, a shift in Thor's body chemistry, or if the bear had simply responded to its own wild instinct after years of suppression. State wildlife officials had to make a decision. Thor had killed a human. There was no precedent for rehabilitation. No sanctuary was equipped to take a 900-pound killer Kodiak. There was only one outcome that authorities deemed possible: Thor was euthanized within 48 hours of Bob Doornbos's death. The death of Bob Doornbos became a turning point in wildlife management training. His case is now taught in every accredited wildlife safety course in North America. The lesson is simple: a wild animal that has been hand-raised from infancy is not a pet. It is not tame. It is a wild animal that has been fed by human hands, and that changes nothing about its fundamental nature. One day, without warning, that nature can emerge. Bob Doornbos was buried in Michigan. The wildlife facility was eventually shut down. Thor, the Kodiak bear that Bob Doornbos loved and cared for every single morning of his adult life, was the first and last thing Bob Doornbos saw on the morning of November 16, 1990. The bucket was never used again. 30 years later, wildlife safety trainers still use this case to teach the most fundamental rule: wild animals are not our friends. They are not our family. They are wild. And no matter how much love you pour into feeding one every single morning, the moment it decides to stop eating and start hunting, love will not save you. If you work with wildlife, if you care for animals, if you believe you are the exception, watch Bob Doornbos's story and ask yourself, are you willing to bet your life on it? Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, please like and follow our page for more real stories of how nature teaches us the hardest lessons.